It is amazing to be here. I want to start this afternoon by sharing something very personal with you. My daughter is now nearly 18 years old. I know, I don't look old enough, do I? How many of you have children of your own? Can you raise your hand? Yeah, I can tell. People who have children sit like this. But I never thought that I would feel this way, because my little girl is now grown up and she's about to leave home. But recently, my wife and I went to her very final parent-teacher evening, where we were going to talk about her last ever report. Now, we went to see her history teacher, and she loves her history teacher, which I hate, because her history teacher is young and handsome, and all my daughter ever talks about is how wonderful her history teacher is. You know, when your children are very little, they think you know everything. When they get older, they think you know nothing. But her history teacher, he knows everything. So, we sit down, my wife and my history teacher starts talking. And it turns out that my history teacher loves my daughter as much as my daughter loves my history teacher. He starts off by telling us how wonderful our daughter is. Oh, she is the most wonderful person. He's not seen her bedroom. So he tells us the reason why she is so wonderful is because her essays, her assignments are perfect. Oh, he says, her history assignments are filled with so many ideas. She seems to understand things from different viewpoints in such a mature way. At this point, I start giggling like a little boy. At the same time, my wife did something that she hasn't done in the 21 years we've been married. She took my hand and held it under the table. I know. Because I'm a man, I didn't read the situation properly. I thought, tonight is my birthday. I couldn't have been more wrong. You see, my wife knew exactly why I was giggling. Because I know how my daughter does her history assignments. So she comes home, and she has thousands of friends around the world on Twitter and Facebook. and she types into her computer the title of her assignment. And then she sits back and waits. Within 5 minutes, there are messages coming from all over the world, and people have written my daughter's assignment for her. Now, in a traditional education system, a teacher would say that my daughter was cheating. I don't agree. I think my daughter is a perfect 21st century citizen. Because in the 21st century, we don't need to know, but we do need to find out how to understand. And the thing that my daughter does well is she takes the information from all over the world, and then she questions it, and she thinks about it, and she edits it, and she pulls out the bits that matter to answer the challenge she has. She doesn't need to spend her time learning and remembering things. She has to develop the skills that allow her to think for herself. Now, the reason I tell you that story is because whether we like it or not, education is changing. And there is a revolution going on around the world that we can no longer control. Our children are not going to wait for some politician to come along and give us permission to change the way we educate our children. They are changing the system for themselves, and they are doing it now. Now, teachers have two choices. One is we stay where we are and we moan about the policies, whilst our children decide that schools are no longer relevant to them. Or two, we follow the courage and brilliance of our children, and we find a way to transform the system ourselves. One thing I've learned over the last few years as I travel is that too many of us wait to be given permission to change the system. We could wait forever. That permission will never come. Politically, it is far too dangerous. As we know, politicians work with a vision that lasts no more than 4 years. Our children are in school for 3 times that length of time. If you think about how fast the world is changing, imagine the students that you teach who will be leaving school this year. How far has the world changed since the day they started school? Think about that. When this generation of children leaving school this summer started their education, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no Amazon. None of these things existed. Imagine where we'll be in 15 years' time. And the greatest challenge we face is that we have to stop talking about change, and we have to start taking action Because otherwise, we will be sat here in this same room in 15 years' time talking about the future of education. And one of the really interesting things for me is that we still keep talking about the 21st century as if that was the future. Children being born today, because of the development in medical science, will live in the 22nd century. Yet what we keep doing is coming up with new policies and new ideas that we build on top of what we already do. We haven't really begun to transform the education system. We just keep building on top of what we already do. And of course, the greatest problem with political policy is not focused on the future. There is no clear vision. Political policy is always based on the lowest common denominator. It is not a vision for excellence. It is a vision for mediocrity. We did not come into teaching, did we? To teach mediocrity. We came into teaching to make a difference to our children's lives. And it's why, as we really work through this process, we have to take a step backwards. So as we go through this afternoon, and you hear the incredible speakers that will be here in front of you today, think about what they've said to you. I want you to remember, it's not just about new ideas and things you can do tomorrow in your classroom. We have to take our time and take a step backwards. We need to rethink our basic vision for education. You know, I had an incredible experience just a few months ago. I had the incredible opportunity to have lunch with Eric Schmidt, who is the executive chairman of Google, possibly one of the most powerful businessmen in the world. And we talked a lot about the challenges that he faces and about education. The first thing I want to tell you that he said about education was in reply to a question I asked him. It was something that I've been interested in for a very long time. And I asked him straight. I said, Eric, do you ever think there'll be a time when technology makes teachers irrelevant? The really interesting thing about his reply is that he didn't need to stop to think about his answer. It was immediate. And I want to share it with you now. What he said, without having to think about it, was no, never. Technology will never replace the teacher, because education at its heart will always be about human relationships, because education at its heart is always about the development of the human being first. He said, technology is exciting. Technology will help to change the way we educate. But at its heart, education is about the development of the human being. Now, I love that, don't you? Education is about the heart, is at the heart of the human being. It is an organic process. It is about the nurturing and development of each individual child. The second thing he said was interesting to me because it represents, I think, a challenge for us in education today around the world. He said, you know, and he was talking about his own experience at Google. He said, you know, when we started Google, it was really easy to do what we did. He said we were a collection of young, brilliant people who kept coming up with amazing ideas to change the world. He said we had a clear vision. Our vision was simple. We were going to organize the world's information so that it was easy for people to access. And he said also, our ambition was never to do evil. He said the interesting thing is, we were always at our most creative and our most dynamic in the early days. As we became more successful, he said, it became more difficult to be innovative and creative. Because we stopped focusing on the things that we were passionate about. We stopped focusing on our own ideas. Because as we became more successful, we became obsessed with what other people were doing. We became obsessed with what Microsoft were doing and what Facebook was doing. So what would happen is we'd say to each other, oh, have you seen what Microsoft are doing? We need to go over there and do what they're doing. And then somebody else would say, have you seen what Facebook's doing? We need to go this way and do what Facebook's doing. And he said, you know, when I look at our history, all of our failures have come when we've moved away from our own vision and focused on just trying to copy somebody else. Now, just for a minute, think about the way that education policy in Spain and the UK and the US is driven today. It is driven by a report that comes out every 3 years that we all know and love, called PISA. Shoot me. And what happens every 3 years? We look at these league tables like it's La Liga. And we're always trying to copy Real Madrid or Barcelona. Whoever's top. We all go running to find out what they're doing. And we go, we've got to do what they're doing. For example, for the last 3 years, how sick are you of hearing about how perfect Finland is? Everybody went to Finland. Teach us how to do what you do, oh great Finland. Now, according to the latest league tables, Finland are 12th. So now, we go running after China. Oh, Shanghai! What are you doing, you wise, wise people? I'll tell you what Shanghai are doing. They're about to move away from their academic model. Did you know that about a year ago, just over a year ago now, the government in China changed. The next generation came in. Governments in China have a 10-year lifespan. And the new government began just a few months ago. And the Minister of Education gave a speech when they started their job. And it was a fascinating one, because they said this: if China is to have a future economically, we have to discover and nurture the next generation of Steve Jobs. Currently, our system is too obsessed with testing and academic performance to allow those children to show themselves. Now, what fascinates me is that this was not just a speech. In August of 2013, China released a 10-point plan to take away the academic pressure on students in Chinese education. Let me share with you some of the new laws in schools in China. Number 1, you'll love this one. Homework is now banned. True. Number 2, testing must be dramatically reduced. Number 3, children can no longer be streamed by ability. Those are just 3 of the 10-point plan to remove academic focus in Chinese schools. Yet what do we keep doing in Spain, in the UK, in the US? We keep believing that the way to ensure our children are successful in the future is to be obsessed with a traditional model of education, which is about preparing children to take tests. It doesn't work. This is something I've shown in Spain before, but this is a new version. This is a league table I much prefer to PISA. This is called GEDI. It stands for the Global Entrepreneurship and Development Index. Unlike PISA, these results are published every year. There are currently 121 participating countries in GEDI. This report is from the 2014 league table. What it does is it grades and ranks countries according to how much of their economic wealth comes. That's a politician trying to interrupt my speech. They're all around us, everywhere. I shall stand. I'm not going to move. Okay. So, what it does is it ranks countries by how much of their economic wealth comes from entrepreneurship, enterprise, and new business. Now, I've mixed them up, but I've listed some of the countries participating in the 2014 report. We're going to have a quiz. Just for 5 seconds while I have a drink of water, I'd like you to collaborate with the person next to you. And I'd like you to work out who you think are the most entrepreneurial in that list to the least entrepreneurial. Are you ready? Go. Talk to the person next to you. Teachers are always worse behaved than their students. Have you noticed that? I'm watching. Okay. Who's brave enough with a loud voice? It's just for fun. Who's brave enough with a loud enough voice? Shout out one of the countries that they think would be in the top 3. Are you ready? Shout them out. India? China? USA? That sounded like an American voice down there. USA! Who? Okay, I know what you're doing, Madrid. Okay, you're clever people. What you've thought is, if we shout out all of the countries on the list, we'll be correct. Let me share with you the results from the 2014 report. Now, the next slide will show you those countries ranked in order from the most entrepreneurial to the least entrepreneurial. And in red writing, we'll show you the number of where they rank out of 121 participating nations. Are you ready? Now, I don't know about you, this interests me because towards the bottom half, you have the BRIC countries. Brazil, India, Russia, China are all lower down the list because, of course, most of their economy currently is in the middle of the industrial age. They are currently in economies which demand the use and sale of natural resources, factories, and traditional industry. They are not yet in the economic phase of their development that requires them to have entrepreneurial incomes. However, they all realize, particularly China, that an industrial economy can only last so long. And once an economy becomes wealthy, its consumers demand a new way of living. And in the West, we've had that kind of economy for a long time. And that kind of economy is determined by an ability to be entrepreneurial and enterprising. Now, the second thing that fascinates me about this is if you compare that league table to PISA, it's almost the opposite way round. Yet we obsess with wanting a system more like China's. Why? When you look at the countries at the top of that list, particularly at countries like Finland, Sweden, Australia, Canada, they have some of the most humane and three-dimensional education systems in the world, where there is a far greater focus on the development of the whole child and not just the academic child. So you tell me, what should we be focusing on? Because for me, our job should be to focus on trying to make sure our children are more entrepreneurial and enterprising. Now, I think I'm running out of time. Can somebody help me? What time must I finish? 6:30. About 15 minutes. Good news. You've got another 15 minutes of me. Sorry. So, what does it mean? What does it mean to be a more entrepreneurial and enterprising thinker? I know that Robert will be far more expert than me as he closes the conference this afternoon, so I'm not going to spend long on this. But I want to share a story of another remarkable meeting I had recently with a man who has changed the world. Now, I'm very lucky in my life because I get the chance to meet many amazing people. But this is the only time in my life I think I've ever met anyone who I can say has truly changed the world. A few months ago, I gave a speech in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And the other keynote speaker was this man. Now, I thought I was lucky because at the venue, I got to spend 5 minutes with him talking in the room where the speakers were waiting. Imagine my amazement and excitement when I boarded my flight from Riyadh to London, a flight that takes 7 hours. and sat next to me on the plane was this man. I was like, no. He was like, no. I had a wonderful flight. You've never seen when we landed in London, I've never seen anyone run off a plane so quickly in all my life. But I couldn't not talk to the man, because the man's name was Steve Wozniak. I know, right? If you get 7 hours sat with Steve Wozniak, you're going to use it. So we were talking on the plane. And I have to tell you, I really like this man. He's very, very shy. And you would never know that he was the co-creator of Apple computers. He's not a celebrity. He's none of those things. And he was telling me that when he was 8, 9 years of age, he said, you know, Richard, I was one of those children who was socially inept. I didn't know how to make friends. I didn't know how to play with people. He said, I was that child that would sit at the back of a classroom wishing I knew how to play with other students. He said, I can't pretend to tell you that I knew when I was that age that I was genuinely going to change the world. He said, but I remember sitting in my classroom thinking to myself, when I grow up, I want to make the world better for people like me. I want to do something that makes the world easier for people like me to communicate. He said, and at that time in my life, based on the experiences I had, he said, I had 2 ambitions. My first ambition, he said, was to be an engineer. He said, my father was an engineer, and what I knew even at 8 or 9 years of age was that engineers change the world. He said, my other option, my other idea, and this is the moment I truly fell in love with Steve Wozniak. He said, the other thing I could do to make the world better for people like me was to be a teacher. Anyway, he said, it won't surprise you to know that I chose engineering because, he said, to be honest with you, there's more money in engineering. And he's not wrong. So anyway, he said, you know, when I left Apple, I was a very lucky man because I knew that I was never going to have to work another day in my life. He said, and having fulfilled my first ambition as an engineer, he said, I decided it was time to fulfill my second ambition. He said to me, no one knows this because I didn't want it to be public. But he said for years after I left Apple, he said I worked nearly full-time in a local state school teaching technology. Imagine that. Boys and girls, your new technology teacher, Steve Wozniak. You'd listen, wouldn't you? You'd listen to what he had to say. Anyway, so then I said to him, I said, Steve, tell me, what have you learnt most about education then from your time running Apple and then as a teacher? And he said, I'll tell you the first thing I know for definite. He said this, what you teach is really no longer important. How you learn will define how successful your future is. Let me repeat that. What you learn is no longer important, but how you learn will define how successful you are in your future. Now, I don't know about you, but I trust Steve Wozniak a lot more than I do any politician, because he's been there. Then he said to me this, he said, I'll tell you why I say that, Richard, apart from my time in school. He said, you know, when Steve and I set up Apple, we had no idea. We had no idea what we were doing. He said we were a couple of kids mucking about with technology, with transistors and wires and batteries and power. He said I was having fun. I just did it because I loved it. He said the problem was that Steve was born a salesman, and he would see opportunity everywhere he went. He said he used to drive me mad, actually. He said because Steve would march into places like Hewlett-Packard, and he would get them to give him hundreds of thousands of dollars for an exciting new product that we'd created. And then he said he'd march back into the garage where we were working, and he'd say, Voz, I've just got us $150,000 from Hewlett-Packard. And my first question to him every time would be, what have you promised them, Steve? And Steve would tell him, and Voz would say, but we haven't invented that, Steve. And Jobs would say to Steve Wozniak, don't worry, you've got 72 hours to make it. So, he said things started to develop very, very quickly. He said people started throwing huge amounts of money at us, which he said for two boys who had dropped out of college was very, very scary. He said because we'd never run or managed anything in our lives, and all of a sudden we knew we were going to have to start hiring people and building a proper company. He said that was scary. He said, so one night Steve and I went out for a beer. He said, I'll never forget it. We went for a beer and we started talking about the kind of people we wanted to employ. And Jobs, he said, the genius of Steve Jobs was that he knew that if at Apple we spent our lives making things, we would be dead in 3 years. He said we had to be a company that constantly invented and innovated and changed the world around us. He said that was Jobs' greatest genius. He knew that. Which meant that night in the bar, we had to have a conversation about what kind of person we were going to employ. And the problem for us was this. We were in Silicon Valley. The cleverest people in the world were hanging out in Silicon Valley. The finest graduates from all over the world were heading to Silicon Valley. The finest math brains, the finest science, physics, chemistry brains, the finest technology and engineering minds in the world were heading to Silicon Valley. He said, so we knew that hiring clever people was going to be easy. However, he said, we knew being clever wasn't enough. And that night we came up with a mantra. He said, Steve Jobs loves mantras. And he said that night we came up with a mantra which would define how we would recruit employees in Apple. He said, you know, it must have worked because Apple still use it today. He said, and the mantra is this: At Apple, we will never employ anybody who needs managing. We will never employ anybody who needs managing. Our education system is designed specifically to train children to be managed. We need to flip what we do. And I leave you with this final thought and challenge as you think through the incredible speakers this afternoon. The question we should be asking as we redesign our education system for the future is this: how do we create a generation of students, of learners, who don't need teaching? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.